Little Trump girl cried as leftist coach banned the national anthem, but a Way Too veteran suddenly returned and said, "Subscribe to the channel right now to find out the end of this epic story and comment below which part of this great America you are watching from." The autumn afternoon sun beat down on the athletic field with a golden intensity, a light that in other times might have evoked a nostalgia for America's glory days. Days when sweat, effort, and glory mingled in the pure air of liberty. Yet, on that specific day, the luminosity couldn't seem to pierce the invisible but palpable smog of tension hanging over Oak Creek High School. The vast, imposing blue sky served only as an ironic backdrop to the human storm brewing on the ground. The metal bleachers, radiating heat, were speckled with anxious fathers, worried mothers, and students who instinctively lowered their voices, sensing that the electric atmosphere foreshadowed not a sporting celebration, but a summary judgment. In the center of that stage of red clay and white lime lines stood Jemima, a girl of only 14, whose usually upright and proud posture was beginning to buckle under a crushing weight. Jemima wasn't a typical teenager molded by social media algorithms or fleeting trends of hollow rebellion. She was known with affection by her family and with sneers by her detractors at school as the little MAGA girl. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a high ponytail, adorned with a pink ribbon that, in its simplicity, screamed an innocence the modern world seemed hell-bent on destroying. She wore the blue track team uniform, but the detail that captured the eye and defined her identity was the stylized American flag printed on her chest. To Jemima, that wasn't just polyester and ink. It was a sacred mantle, a heritage of values passed down from generation to generation, representing faith, family, and individual freedom. But there, on that field, the symbol she loved had become the target of relentless ideological fury. The young girl felt her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic drum echoing the fear that dried her throat. Her blue eyes, usually bright with the determination of someone dreaming of winning races, were now welling up, struggling to hold back tears that threatened to breach the dam of her pride. She felt tiny, isolated on an island of vulnerability, surrounded by an ocean of complicit silence and open hostility. Towering before her like a spire of manufactured moral indignation was Coach Miller. He bore no resemblance to the mentors of yesteryear, men who taught character through discipline and mutual respect. Miller was the living incarnation of the radical activism that had hijacked educational institutions, turning classrooms and sports fields into laboratories of social engineering. His figure emanated an aggression barely contained by a thin veneer of civility that was about to shatter. He wore an impeccable white shirt, but what drew all attention and fear was the armband he sported on his left arm. Emblazoned with rainbow colors, the accessory wasn't there in that moment to communicate love or tolerance. It functioned as a rank, a badge of supreme authority that granted him the power to dictate what was virtuous and what was profane. Coach Miller's face was contorted, a grotesque mask of contempt and sanctimonious fury. His nostrils flared with heavy breathing, and his eyes, fixed on Jemima, didn't see a child. They saw a political enemy, an obstacle to progress, a living representation of everything his ideology had taught him to hate and destroy. The conflict hadn't started with shouting, but with a disturbing silence. Minutes earlier, the teams had lined up on the track, shoulders brushing lightly, the smell of rubber and cut grass in the air. It was the sacred moment preceding the sport, the instant where differences should be set aside for fair competition. Jemima, as she always did, had turned toward the flagpole, her right hand instinctively finding the left side of her chest, ready to feel the vibration of the first notes of the Star-Spangled Banner. She waited to hear the anthem that united the nation, the melody that honored those who had bled so she could run freely on that field. But the sound never came. Instead, the school's PA system, controlled by a new administrative directive influenced by the diversity committee of which Miller was chairman, emitted only a dry crackle, followed by the coach's own voice, amplified and distorted by static. "Attention, students and parents." His voice reverberated, cold and cutting. "Today, we are implementing a new policy of inclusion. We have decided to suspend the playing of the national anthem." A confused murmur rippled through the bleachers. Parents exchanged glances, uncomfortable but paralyzed by the social fear of appearing old-fashioned or intolerant. Miller continued, his voice taking on a professorial and condescending tone. "The anthem, as we all know, or should know if we had a correct historical education, is a symbol of systemic oppression. It represents a colonialist and exclusionary past that has no place in our equitable future. Therefore, on my field, we will not celebrate division. We will celebrate the silence of reflection." To Jemima, those words felt like a physical punch to the gut. She had grown up listening to her grandfather's stories, reading about the founding fathers, learning that the flag was a symbol of hope for the world, not oppression. The cognitive dissonance was violent. Her innocence, protected until then by family love, collided head-on with the brutal cynicism of school indoctrination. She looked sideways, seeking support from her teammates. Some girls looked at the ground, ashamed. Others, already molded by the fear of cancellation, nodded slightly, agreeing with the coach to ensure their own social survival. No one moved. No one protested. The silence of the good was deafening. It was then that, driven by a courage she didn't even know she possessed, a courage inherited from ancestors who did not bow to tyrants, Jemima took a step forward. The sound of her sneaker scratching the gravel was the only noise in the stadium. "But, coach!" Her voice came out shaky, thin, betraying her youth and nervousness. Miller, who was already turning to start the warm-up, stopped abruptly. He rotated his body slowly, like a predator detecting unexpected movement in the brush. "What did you say, Jemima?" he asked, his tone dangerously soft. Jemima swallowed hard, her hands sweating cold. She knew she was stepping into a minefield, but the truth burned in her chest. "The anthem. It's for all of us," she continued, gaining a little more strength, though her legs trembled. "We sing to honor those who died for our freedom. My great-grandfather fought in the war. He said the anthem was the voice of America. The mention of war, honor, and family tradition was the spark that detonated the gunpowder accumulated in Coach Miller's ego." The mask of pedagogical calm dropped instantly, revealing the raw face of fanaticism. He advanced toward the girl, invading her personal space with an aggression that made the parents in the bleachers hold their breath. "You dare interrupt me with that toxic nationalist rhetoric?" he exploded, the shout echoing through the valley, startling birds in the nearby trees. He pointed his index finger rigidly at Jemima's face, inches from her nose, a weapon of intimidation aimed at the girl's soul. "Who do you think you are, girl? You think because you wear that flag and parrot what you hear in your bubble of privilege, you understand anything about the world?" Spittle flew from his mouth as he screamed, and Jemima instinctively recoiled, shrinking away. She had never been treated with such verbal violence by an adult. "You are indoctrinated," he bellowed, the word coming out like a dirty insult. "A little fascist in training. It is exactly people like you, with this blind worship of symbols of hate, who impede the progress of this nation." The words fascist, hate, and privilege were thrown like stones, intended to wound and humiliate. The scene was heartbreaking. Jemima brought her hands to her face, covering her eyes, unable to face the distorted fury of the man who was supposed to be her leader. Hot tears began to flow, wetting her fingers, tracing paths of pain on her flushed cheeks. She sobbed quietly, a sound of absolute helplessness. The sports field, which should be a place of joy and overcoming, had transformed into an ideological tribunal where she was the sole defendant, judged and condemned without the right to a defense. Miller, sensing the impact of his words and the terrified silence of the other students, felt even more powerful. He fed on that fear. He spun toward the audience and then turned back to the weeping girl, using her as a macabre teaching example. "Look at her!" he shouted to the other players, who backed away, afraid of being associated with the heretic. This is what happens when you cling to a racist and imperialist past. Her crying is the crying of someone losing power. Do not feel pity, feel anger at what she represents. He leaned over Jemima, his shadow covering the girl, blocking out the sun. "You want to sing the anthem? Go sing it in your backward church or at your rallies. Here, on this field, we obey the rules of equity and social justice. And if you don't like it, you can take off that uniform right now and get out of my sight." The humiliation was total. Jemima felt naked before hundreds of eyes. The weight of the injustice was so great, she struggled to breathe. Where were the adults? Why didn't the parents come down from the bleachers to stop this out-of-control man? She could hear murmurs, saw some parents standing up, but being pulled back by their spouses. The fear of being filmed, labeled and fired from their jobs, speaking louder than the instinct to protect. Cancel culture had created an invisible prison around all of them, and Jemima was alone in the center of the cell. She was the sacrificial victim on the altar of the new morality. Coach Miller, seeing that no one intervened, smiled with disdain, crossing his arms over his chest, the colored armband shining ironically under the sun. "Cry all you want, Jemima," he said, lowering his tone to a cruel whisper, audible only to her and the nearest girls. "Your tears won't bring the old America back. The future is ours, and in our future there is no room for your cheap patriotism." Jemima, shaking uncontrollably, felt her legs give way. She fell to her knees in the red dirt, her head down, the ponytail with the pink ribbon hanging sadly. She was the image of defeat, of innocence, crushed by the boot of an ideology that knew no mercy. The world seemed to have turned grey, the golden sun now seeming cold and distant. She was alone, completely and terrifyingly alone. The reddish dust of the track adhered to Jemima's sweaty skin, mixing with the tears that continued to flow, turning her youthful face into a mask of suffering and grime. The sun, indifferent to human cruelty, continued to shine, but for Jemima, the world had plunged into a cold, suffocating darkness. She remained on her knees, a posture of forced submission that seemed to deeply please Coach Miller. He didn't back down upon seeing her fall. On the contrary, the girl's collapse seemed to act as a stimulant for his ideological fury, validating his twisted belief that the brute force of his rhetoric was actually a tool of social justice. He began to pace in circles around her, like a predator circling wounded prey, his heavy steps kicking up small clouds of dust that irritated the girl's already swollen eyes. The silence of the crowd had turned into a tense hum, a static energy of fear and complicity hovering over the field like a toxic fog. No one dared to breathe too loudly, afraid of attracting the modern inquisitor's attention. "Lift your head when I speak to you," Miller barked, his voice slicing the air like a whip. The command wasn't an invitation to dignity, but a demand for recognition of his authority. Jemima, trembling, raised her face slowly. Her eyes met the coach's, and in that moment she saw the true abyss dividing the nation. There was no empathy there, none of the compassion he preached so much in his inclusion classes. There was only cold, calculating hate. "You think crying will save you, Jemima?" he sneered, crossing his arms and highlighting the rainbow armband even more, which in that context seemed like a cruel irony. These are the tears of someone who has never had to face reality, tears of white privilege. You're crying because, for the first time in your sheltered life, someone said no to your toxic nationalism. He paused dramatically, looking at the bleachers, ensuring his captive audience was absorbing the lesson. She cries because the real world no longer accepts the racist fantasy her parents sold her as patriotism. The mention of her parents hit Jemima with the force of a physical blow. She felt a wave of heat rise up her neck. Her parents were good people, honest workers who taught her to love God, respect the law, and honor the flag. Hearing this man, who knew nothing about the love that existed in her home, distort the image of her family was unbearable. With a titanic effort, Jemima tried to stand. Her legs wobbled, but a flame of indignation lit up in her chest. She couldn't allow him to speak like that. Bracing her hands on her scraped knees, she rose, still trembling, but standing. "Don't speak. Don't speak about my parents," she whispered, her voice hoarse, failing but audible. Miller stopped pacing. He tilted his head, feigning surprise, a sneer curving the corners of his mouth. "What? The little MAGA girl has a voice." He ridiculed, using the nickname the school bullies used, legitimizing the bullying institutionally. "You want to defend your parents, the ones who taught you that this flag on your chest is worth more than the dignity of minorities? The ones who idolize Trump and reject progress?" The word Trump left Miller's mouth as if it were poison, loaded with visceral contempt. He continued, raising the volume, turning the dialogue into a unilateral political rally. "You people, and this sick obsession with the past. You talk about make America great again, but the America you want is an America of exclusion, of walls, of hate. We are trying to build a future, Jemima, a future of democratic socialism, of equity, where there is no room for this type of fanaticism you carry stamped on that shirt." He pointed violently at her chest, at the stylized American flag. That right there isn't a symbol of freedom. It's a symbol of hate. It's a rag stained with blood that you wear with pride because you lack the intellectual capacity to understand real history. The verbal assault was relentless. Miller wasn't just attacking a girl. He was trying to deconstruct her identity, piece by piece, in front of all her peers. He wanted her to feel ashamed of who she was, where she came from, and what she believed in. Jemima felt the world spin. His words were complex, full of academic and sociological jargon she barely fully understood, but the malicious intent behind them was crystal clear. She tried to answer, tried to invoke the simple and powerful lessons she learned in Sunday school and at family dinners. But America is the land of the free, she stammered, tears falling again against her will. We are free to think, to believe. Miller let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed hauntingly through the silent stadium. Freedom? He repeated with scorn. You don't have freedom to spread intolerance on my field, girl. Your freedom ends where my right begins to create a safe space for the students who actually matter, those who have been marginalized by the system you defend. He took another step forward, invading her personal space again, forcing her to retreat. You are a danger, Jemima. You are a seed of fascism that needs to be plucked out before it grows. The accusation of fascism was the coup de grace to Jemima's emotional resistance. She looked around, desperate, seeking a friendly gaze, a gesture of support. She saw her teammates, girls with whom she shared snacks and secrets, look away. She saw the team captain, a girl who always said the team was a family, nervously fiddle with her shoelaces, refusing to intervene. The fear of cancellation, the terror of being Coach Miller's next target, had paralyzed human solidarity. Jemima was being isolated, surgically separated from the group, transformed into an untouchable pariah. Miller sensed her isolation and seized the moment to deliver the final attack on her hope. "Look around, Jemima," he whispered, now with a dangerously calm, almost sibilant voice. "No one is coming to save you. No one agrees with you. They know I'm right. They know your time is up." He then changed tactics, moving from public humiliation to a direct threat to her future. "I have the power here," he said, puffing out his chest. "I can ensure you never run on this team again. I can put a note in your permanent record stating that you incited hate speech and insubordination. Do you know what that will do to your chances of getting into college? Do you know what that will do to your life?" Jemima's eyes widened, panic seizing every fiber of her being. College, the dream of being a nurse, everything seemed to be crumbling before this man's tyranny. He was using the system, the school bureaucracy, as a weapon to bend her. "But I am generous," Miller continued, with a sadistic smile. "I will give you a choice, a chance at redemption." He pointed to the field exit. "You can leave here right now, go to the locker room, take off that offensive shirt, and throw it in the trash where it belongs. Then you will come back here and publicly apologize to me and the team for trying to impose your bigoted values on us. If you do that, maybe I'll let you stay on the team." The proposal hung in the air, heavy and repugnant. He was demanding she renounce her faith, her family, and her country in exchange for acceptance. He wanted her to spit on the flag to save her own skin. Jemima felt her stomach churn. The pressure was unbearable. Every instinct for survival screamed for her to obey, for her to submit and make the pain stop. But something inside her, a small, stubborn voice, the voice of the little MAGA girl, resisted. She looked at the flag on her chest, dirty with dust but still vibrant in red, white, and blue. She remembered her great-grandfather, long past, and the stories about Normandy. Had he retreated? Had he apologized to the Nazis to avoid being hurt? The comparison seemed absurd to an outside observer, but to that girl's heart, the battle was spiritual. However, human strength has limits, and Jemima was just a child. The weight of the adult world, with its rabid ideologies and psychological manipulation tactics, was too great for her narrow shoulders. She felt her strength draining away, her shoulders slumped. The sob that escaped her throat was a sound of surrender. She began, her voice fading. Miller smiled, victorious. He saw the break. He saw the exact moment her spirit was about to snap. "Come on, Jemima," he encouraged her cruelly. "Say it. Say you were wrong. Say patriotism is a disease. Free yourself." He leaned in closer, savoring the triumph. The crowd was in absolute silence, witnessing the ritual sacrifice of innocence on the altar of radical progressivism. Darkness seemed to have won. The flag seemed about to be folded and forgotten. Jemima closed her eyes, unable to see her tormentor's triumphant smile, and prepared to pronounce the words of defeat he so desired to hear. The despair was total, absolute, and devastating. There was no way out, there was no hope, or at least so it seemed, until a different sound, rhythmic and firm, began to stand out in the background, coming from the stadium entrance, something that didn't belong in that circus of modern horrors. The silence preceding Jemima's capitulation was thick, a viscous substance made of fear and resignation that seemed to stick to everyone's skin. Coach Miller, eyes gleaming with sadistic anticipation, leaned forward, lips parted, ready to drink in the apology that would validate his tyranny. He could already taste the victory, the broken girl, the dishonored flag, the triumphant ideology. Jemima opened her mouth, air entering her lungs in a shaky sigh, preparing to renounce her dignity. But the words never came out. In that precise instant, when hope seemed to have evaporated from Oak Creek Field, the atmosphere underwent a seismic shift. The sound heard in the distance, ignored until then, became impossible to miss. Thud, step, thud, step. It wasn't the sound of high-tech modern sneakers, nor the buzz of the cowardly crowd. It was the dry, rhythmic, unmistakable sound of wood-striking asphalt, accompanied by the firm scrape of old military boots. The noise cut through the air like a blade, interrupting the hypnotic trance Miller had imposed on the stadium. The coach, irritated by the interruption of his moment of glory, snapped his head toward the track entrance. "Who dares interrupt my class?" he snarled, arrogance dripping from every syllable. But the question died in his throat, choked by a sight that defied the logic of that modern, cynical world. Emerging from the heat haze, rising from the asphalt, walking with a determination that ignored the frailty of age, was Sergeant Major Samuel. He looked like a spectre summoned by the girl's desperate need, a figure displaced in time, yet present with a terrifying solidity. The afternoon sun reflected off the gold buttons of his khaki uniform, impeccably preserved, a fabric that carried the history of a nation in its weave. On his chest, rows of ribbon decorations formed a colorful mosaic of bravery. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, campaign badges from Europe that most students present only new through distorted history books. Samuel didn't run. He advanced. He leaned on a dark wooden cane, polished by use, but his spine was erect, defying gravity and the years. His face was a map of deep trenches, wrinkles carved by the Normandy sun and the cold wind of the Ardennes. But his eyes, those grey eyes, burned with a fire no longer seen in modern men. It was the gaze of someone who had stared absolute evil in the eye and hadn't blinked. He ignored the crowd in the bleachers, ignored the whispers. His focus was entirely on the grotesque scene in the center of the field. A grown man abusing his power against a defenseless child. With every step, the aura of moral authority emanating from the veteran pushed Miller's toxicity back, clearing the air. The leftist, confronted with that apparition, tried to regain control. His mind, programmed for academic debates and social media shouting matches, had no protocol for dealing with the raw reality of military honor. "Hey, you there!" Miller shouted, trying to project authority, but his voice sounded thin, shrill, losing the gravity he thought he possessed. "This is a restricted area for authorized school personnel. You are invading a safe space. Leave now, or I will call security." He pointed his finger at the veteran, the same aggressive gesture he had used against Jemima. It was a fatal mistake. Sergeant Samuel stopped 10 feet away. The sound of the cane hitting the ground echoed like a judge's gavel ending a session. He looked at Miller's outstretched finger, then raised his gaze to the coach's eyes, with a calm and devastating contempt. "Lower that finger, son," Samuel said. His voice wasn't a shout, it was a subterranean rumble, gravelly, deep, loaded with gunpowder. "Before you lose the arm." The threat wasn't physical, but the absolute certainty with which it was uttered sent a shiver down the spine of everyone listening. Miller, instinctively, pulled his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. You can't threaten me," the coach stammered, taking a step back, the facade of courage crumbling. "I am an educator. I represent the future. You are just an old relic of a violent past." Samuel took another step, invading the coach's safety bubble, his physical presence, though aged, seeming gigantic. "A violent past?" The veteran repeated, the irony sharp in his voice. "I saw real violence, boy. I saw beaches turn red, so men like you could have the luxury of standing there, safe, and spitting on the flag that draped my brother's coffins." He pointed with his cane at Miller's rainbow armband. "You talk about tolerance with that band on your arm, preach about inclusion, but all I see is a petty school tyrant using his position to crush a 14-year-old girl just because she loves her country. That isn't the future. That is old cowardice disguised as virtue." The confrontation was electric. The clash of two eras, of two irreconcilable worldviews. On one side, Miller's moral relativism, performative fury, and aggressive victimhood. On the other, Samuel's absolute truth, tangible sacrifice, and personal responsibility. Miller, sensing he was losing the audience, he could see parents in the stands standing up, some pulling out phones not to film the girl's cancellation, but to record the old man's bravery, tried his last card, bureaucracy and ideology. "You don't understand," he screamed, face red, veins bulging in his neck. "This is about deconstruction. This girl is a symbol of the oppressive white patriarchy. We are cleansing history, and you should be ashamed of the imperialist wars you fought." The veteran didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "I fought against real fascists," Samuel replied, his calm voice cutting through Miller's hysterical screams. "Men who burned books, who banned anthems, who silenced dissidents, and who indoctrinated children to hate their own neighbors and their own heritage. I know the smell of fascism, son, and today it doesn't come in jackboots and swastikas. It comes from you, with your cries of equity and your absolute intolerance for anyone who thinks differently." Samuel pivoted his body, turning his back on the coach as if he weren't worthy of further attention, a mortal insult to the activist's inflated ego. The veteran focused his attention on Jemima. The girl was still on her knees, paralyzed, looking at him through tears, as if seeing a divine apparition. Samuel softened his expression. The hard lines of his face relaxed into overwhelming tenderness. He lowered himself, with some difficulty, knees popping until he was at her eye level. "Dry your face, soldier," he said, extending a large hand, calloused and trembling, but warm and secure. Jemima looked at his hand, then at his kind face. She sobbed, a sound of pure relief, and took the old warrior's hand. With surprising strength he helped her up. "Stand tall," he whispered. "You have no reason to kneel before men like him. You only kneel for God." Jemima felt a wave of strength course through her body, transmitted by the touch of this stranger who seemed to know her better than her teachers. She wiped her tears with the back of her hands, smearing dust and mascara on her face, but for the first time in hours she lifted her chin. The veteran gently adjusted the collar of her uniform, smoothing the stylized flag on her chest that Miller had tried to profane. "It's a beautiful flag," Samuel said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I lost many friends to keep it flying. Don't let anyone tell you it's a symbol of hate. It is the only reason this idiot has the freedom to be an idiot." Behind them, Coach Miller was foaming with rage. He had been humiliated, stripped of his moral authority in front of the whole school. He saw the looks of contempt turning toward him. But the leftist does not accept defeat with honor. He seeks vengeance through the system. "This isn't over," Miller bellowed, backing away toward the administration building, grabbing his smartphone and typing furiously. "You will regret this. I'm reporting this to the school board. This is assault. This is geriatric microaggression. I'm going to get you banned from this property, and I'm going to ensure this girl is expelled for bringing in outside agitators. I'm going to cancel you both on social media. You will lose everything." The threat hung in the air, poisonous. Institutional power. The machinery of cancellation was still in the hands of people like Miller. The veteran knew this. He knew the battle on the field had been won, but the war against the corrupt bureaucracy would be long and dirty. Yet, he showed no fear. He turned his head slightly, looking at Miller one last time over his shoulder. "Do your worst, boy," Samuel said with a corner-of-the-mouth smile. "I survived winter in Bastogne, surrounded by panzer divisions. I think I can survive a diversity committee and some hashtags on Twitter." Miller, powerless before that rock of integrity, turned his back and marched off, screaming into his phone, demanding to speak to the superintendent, promising lawsuits and retaliation. His exit was noisy and undignified. contrasting with the silent dignity that now reigned in the center of the field. Evil had retreated, but left the promise of return. However, in the center of the track, under the golden sun that now seemed to shine with more intensity, the little MAGA girl was no longer alone. She was beside the khaki giant. Fear had vanished from her eyes, replaced by deep admiration and a new understanding of what it meant to be strong. The institutional tension remained. Her future at the school was at risk. The threat of expulsion was real. But in that sacred moment, she was safe under the protection of history. With Coach Miller's stormy and undignified retreat, vanishing into the concrete corridors of the school administration, still shouting bureaucratic threats into his phone, a new and profound stillness descended upon the Oak Creek athletic field. But it was no longer the suffocating silence of fear and submission that had dominated the scene minutes before. It was the reverent silence that follows a miracle or an act of unexpected bravery. The atmosphere, previously charged with negative electricity and ideological tension, now seemed clean, like the air after a summer storm. The dust that Sergeant Major Samuel and the coach had kicked up during the confrontation settled slowly, and the afternoon sun, dipping toward the horizon, bathed everything in an orange light almost divine, highlighting the figure of the old soldier and the patriot girl as if they were living statues in a monument to freedom. Jemima, still holding the veteran's hand, felt the trembling in her legs cease. The warmth of that stranger's hand, calloused by decades of work and war, flowed into her like a transfusion of courage. She looked at his face, observing the deep lines that told stories of sacrifice, and saw a faint smile form under his well-trimmed white mustache. He didn't smile with arrogance, as Miller did, but with the serenity of someone who knows that the truth is an unshakable rock. Samuel gently let go of the girl's hand and leaned on his cane again, turning his body to face the bleachers and the rest of the track team. The other girls, who had previously averted their gaze for fear of being cancelled by association, now watched with wide eyes, a mix of shame for their earlier cowardice and admiration for the scene they were witnessing. In the stands, the parents, freed from the spell of social intimidation imposed by the coach's activism, began to stir. A father, wearing a worn baseball cap, stood up. Then a mother. The dormant American instinct, that flame of independence the indoctrination tried to snuff out, began to flicker again. Sergeant Samuel sensed the shift. He knew that moment needed to be sealed not with more speeches or debates, but with an act of spiritual unity, something that transcended the petty politics that had poisoned that place. He looked at the flagpole at the end of the field, where Old Glory waved lazily, forgotten and disrespected by the school administration. "Daughter," Samuel said, his deep voice echoing in the silence, projecting effortlessly to the last rows of the bleachers. "That man said the anthem was banned. He said it's a symbol of oppression." He paused, looking into Jemima's eyes. "But I think that, in a democracy, the voice of the people speaks louder than the voice of a tyrant with a whistle, and I think we have an anthem to sing, don't we?" Jemima's heart raced, not from fear, but from an overwhelming emotion. She wiped the last trace of a tear from her cheek, straightened her back, and with a renewed pride that made the flag on her chest seem to glow, nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir, we do," she replied, her voice now firm and clear. The veteran didn't need the school's sound system. He didn't need permission from the board. He simply took off his military cap, holding it against his chest with his left hand, and with his right hand resting on the cane raised his chin. From his throat the first note emerged. "Oh, say, can you see?" The voice was raspy, marked by 90 years of life, shaky and imperfect, but loaded with raw, powerful emotion that no professional singer could replicate. It was the sound of authenticity. Jemima, inspired by the old warrior's leadership, joined him immediately. By the dawn's early light, her young, sweet soprano voice intertwined with Samuel's worn baritone, creating an unlikely and beautiful harmony. The old man and the girl, the past and the future, tradition and hope, the effect was instant and overwhelming. Like a dam breaking, the crowd's emotional resistance crumbled. On the track, the team captain, the same one who had looked away before, took a step forward, placed her hand on her chest and began to sing. One by one, the other runners joined in. In the bleachers, the chorus grew exponentially. Fathers, mothers, grandparents, and even some teachers, watching in secret, all stood up. Hats were removed. Hands went to hearts. Oak Creek Stadium, which minutes before was a place of division and ideological hate, transformed into a cathedral of patriotism. What so proudly we hailed. The sound of hundreds of voices singing a cappella reverberated against the school walls, invading the windows of the administration rooms where Miller was likely hiding. It wasn't a song of angry protest. It was a song of affirmation, a collective declaration that, despite all attempts to rewrite history and demonize national heritage, love for the country still lived in the heart of the common people. When they reached the anthem's climax, "O'er the land of the free and the home of the brave," the intensity was such that Jemima felt chills run through her entire body. She looked to the side and saw tears streaming down Sergeant Samuel's hollowed face, but this time they were tears of joy. He looked at the flag, seeing in it the faces of the friends he had lost, knowing that on that school field their memory had been honored. The final "brave" was sustained for long seconds, followed not by awkward silence, but by an explosion of applause, whistles, and chants of "USA! USA!" Shame had changed sides. The little MAGA girl was no longer the pariah. She was the heroine. And the veteran was the savior who had reminded everyone of who they really were. As the applause died down, turning into warm greetings among the parents in the stands, Samuel turned to Jemima one last time. The connection between the two was palpable. He placed both hands on her shoulders, looking at her with paternal seriousness. "They will try to take you down again, dear," he warned, his voice low so only she could hear. "Men like Miller don't give up easily. They will use rules, grades, social pressure. They will call you names worse than today's." Jemima held his gaze, feeling stronger than ever. "I know," she said, "but I'm not afraid anymore." The veteran smiled, a glint of intense pride in his grey eyes. "That's the spirit. Always remember, lions don't lose sleep over the opinion of sheep. You have the blood of patriots in your veins. That flag isn't a burden, it's armor. As long as you wear it with honor, you will never be alone." He took a small metallic object from his tunic pocket and placed it in the palm of Jemima's hand, closing her fingers over it. When she opened her hand, she saw a small, antique pin, an American flag insignia worn by time, which he had likely carried with him during the war. "This was with me in France," he whispered. "Now it's yours, to remind you that freedom costs dearly, but it's worth every penny." Jemima, too moved to speak, just hugged the old soldier. She buried her face in the rough wool fabric of his uniform, smelling mothballs, old tobacco, and history. The hug was captured by dozens of cell phones, an image that would soon go viral, becoming an instant symbol of resistance against cancel culture. The veteran returned the hug, patting the girl's back, awkwardly but affectionately. There, in that embrace, the generational gap was closed. The radical left's attempt to sever the ties between youth and tradition had failed spectacularly. The afternoon's conclusion was marked by a sense of absolute moral triumph. Coach Miller did not return to the field. The team, now under the implicit and natural leadership of Dignity, recovered, finished practice with a spirit of camaraderie that hadn't existed for months. Jemima ran like never before, her feet seeming to have wings, propelled by the certainty that she was on the right side of history. As the sun set, painting the sky with streaks of red and purple that mirrored the flag she loved so much, Jemima stopped at the stadium exit and looked back. Sergeant Samuel was already walking away, his solitary figure moving slowly toward the parking lot, his mission accomplished. He didn't need public thanks or new medals. He had protected the future. The narrative closed with a powerful truth resonating in the minds of Jemima and everyone who witnessed the event. Justice is not something the state or the school grants. It is something conquered with courage. Traditional values, faith, family, and freedom had been tested by the fire of ideological persecution and came out stronger, purified. The little MAGA girl had entered the field as an isolated victim, a scared girl about to be crushed by the machine of progressivism, but left it as a woman grown, a cultural warrior conscious of her strength and legacy. Evil had retreated before the light of truth, proving that, no matter how loud tyranny screams, the whisper of honor will always be heard by the righteous. And as long as there is a child willing to defend the flag and a veteran willing to support her, America will never fall. Freedom, on that day in Oak Creek, had won.